everyone, this is going to be a quick video talking about the 47 Ronin. I'm making this video because December 14th is the day that the 47 Ronin took revenge on Kira. So this all started in the year 1701 when the young daimyo Asano Takumi no Kami Nagamori, otherwise known as Asano Nagamori, was in the shogun's palace learning courtly etiquette. The other daimyo learning with him was named Kamai Korichika, and they were learning from Kira Kozuki no Suki Yoshinaka. For simplicity, I'm just going to call him Kira. Well, at this time, it was common that if you were learning courtly etiquette from someone, you would pay them money. This was sort of a bribe, sort of a tip type of deal. It's a little bit of both. Well, at this time, Asano didn't know this, and as a result, Kira got offended at not getting money, and when Asano did find out, more or less he wasn't going to give him money, because he was already being made fun of. Well, because of this, Kira continued to belittle Asano in front of people, making fun of him for not knowing about courtly etiquette, and kept trying to get the money, and of course Asano would not give him the money after that. The final straw was when Kira made a comment to Asano, more or less saying to him that if he wouldn't pay him, then he'll take a night with Asano's beautiful wife as payment. This was the final straw. Asano grabbed his short sword and slashed at Kira with it. It was not a killing blow, in fact it just cut him across the forehead. Well, they managed to get a hold of Asano, get a hold of Kira, and separate the two. Well, the problem is, now Asano just drew a sword and injured someone in the shogun's court. Drawing his sword would have been bad enough, but to draw and slash someone that the shogun told to help him, it was very bad. So, Asano was placed under arrest. Kira was treated for his injury, and when they were deciding what to do with him, they decided that Asano would have to commit seppuku. Now, I'm not going to get all into what on seppuku because it's a very long topic, very complex, and it can really be its own video, and someday I will do a video on that. So, Asano was sentenced to seppuku, and he did commit seppuku, and afterwards, all in Akko, which is where he was the daimyo for, were plotting revenge. Well, Asano's samurai that accompanied him to Edo, named Oishi, went back to Akko, which is where Asano was the daimyo of, to spread the news about what happened. And immediately they all wanted revenge except for Oishi. Oishi did want revenge, but he knew that it couldn't be right away. Well, what ended up happening was the castle was seized. The castle was seized control of, and all the samurai from Akko were Ronin. Obviously they were Ronin before the castle was seized, but now they didn't have any place to stay, and they had to leave Akko. Well, when they all left, Fuwakuzuman, which is one of Asano's Ronin, he was kicked out of the clan before this all happened because of things that he did. He actually dug up the dead body of a very wealthy merchant's wife, and he used it to test his sword on. He was a kabuki-mono. Kabuki-mono are samurai gangsters, essentially. They were known for creating all kinds of havoc back then. They would do things like fighting in the middle of the street, using very vulgar language, dressing in very bright clothing, cutting down people just to test their swords or techniques, and in this case he dug up the body of a wealthy merchant's wife because she was a very big woman and he wanted a harder target to cut with his sword. So he gathered his armor and met with them all, and they did not want him back because obviously he was already kicked out, so they wouldn't want him. Well, as the story goes on, he did end up helping in the vendetta, but we're not there yet. So all of Asano's men ended up leaving. They had to leave. Now, not all of them did help on the night of the vendetta. Only 47 helped. And there were many more, but keep in mind at the time, a Ronin did not necessarily have a whole lot of options in the way of jobs afterwards. It was already a time of peace, so there wasn't a lot of wars to be had. Not a lot of daimyo were necessarily hiring samurai because, as I said, there were no wars to be had. If you left under such circumstances, to seek new employment, you needed what was basically a letter of reference for the next daimyo, saying that you left under good terms, that you have been a good samurai, you did your duty, and you basically you're highly recommended. Well, in an instance like this, you're not going to be able to get a letter of reference. There's no way. And then on top of that, hiring samurai that worked for someone like Asano who slashed at another samurai in the shogun's court under what was considered a hot-headed issue, not the best thing to do. So as a result, back then, a Ronin, under such circumstances, would have very few options. One of them was being a bodyguard, another would be being an assassin, joining gangs, things like that. They were not going to be able to just go become a samurai for another lord. It wasn't possible. There were other things they would do as well, but the options for a Ronin were very, very slim. You didn't have a whole lot of options. So what they all did was they scattered out, because of the fact that if they would have taken revenge right away, they knew that it was expected. So as a result, Kira had more bodyguards, the shogun had ordered more samurai to be watching Kira's palace, and it was expected. So they knew that their chances of accomplishing their goal was not likely because he's got too many bodyguards. So they all spread. And what they did was Oishi, for example, became a drunkard, and he was consorting with prostitutes. He actually sent his wife away because he told her what he had to do he didn't want her involved in, and he didn't want to hurt her. Others did other work, bodyguards, things like that, various other jobs. Basically things to just throw off the shogun, Kira, and Kira's men to thinking that they're not going to seek revenge. Keep in mind the 47 Ronin had spies watching them as well. So they couldn't just gear up and, go do what they had to do because they were being watched. It would have been known. Many would even get in brawls just to throw off the shogun and his men into thinking that, these are now broken men. They are not going to seek revenge because of the fact that, look, they're not even acting like samurai anymore, let alone thinking that they were going to take revenge. Oishi, for example, even had a spy in his house. He was the cook for Oishi. At one point, Oishi was actually laying drunk in the middle of the street when another samurai walked up to him and kicked him in the face. This samurai was from Satsuma, and he basically told Oishi that he's not a real samurai nor a real man because he didn't take revenge for his lord, for Asano. So after a little bit over a year, when the spies and everything, They stopped watching. They weren't being watched as badly. They planned their revenge. Well, unfortunately, there was not anywhere near as many samurai as had started. Many of them found other work, as I said, not as samurai, but they found other work. They found other things to do. They were not as invested in this incident. So when they counted up, they had 47, one of them being Oishi's own son, which he tried to send away, but he wouldn't go. So Oishi allowed him to take part in the vendetta as well. So then, over a year later, when it wasn't as suspected, they all started planning how they were going to deal with this vendetta. Well, they had several problems, one of them being a lack of armor. The weapons that the 47 Ronin used, I will get into at the end of the video because it is quite interesting, the weapons and the equipment that they had. So when they got to Kira's castle to take revenge, some of the Ronin actually alerted the neighbors that, okay, just so you know, we're here to take part of a vendetta. We are the samurai of Lord Asano, and we are taking our revenge. And apparently Kira wasn't too popular with his neighbors because more or less what they said was, thank God someone's finally going to kill him. Yeah, not a real popular guy with his neighbors. So they managed to get the guardmen for the doors. They went in through the gate and they were trying to get to the doors. Well, they couldn't find the keys. They had the guards there, but they could not find the keys. So they ended up killing the guards and breaking through the door, which was common back during war, with hammers, big hammers, basically sledgehammers, and boom, these were used for breaching, and they had axes as well. And these were all just for breaching the doors. So when they got through, they started fighting Kira's men, and obviously many of them were surprised because this was nighttime, and remember, time of peace, not time of war. So these were not samurai who were on the top of their game. So the 47 Ronin fought off as many as they needed to, which was pretty much all of them that were in the castle. And there were actually some samurai, some of the 47 Ronin, who were taking out the ones who were trying to run away to alert, to get reinforcements. They were up on the roof shooting at them. Well, they ended up fighting through all the samurai that they had to, and when everyone was pretty much dead, they were looking for Kira. They went to his room. He wasn't there. They looked all throughout the house. He was not there. They finally found him in a shed, and when they found him, they're asking, "Are you Kira?" And he wouldn't answer. So what was the identifying mark? The scar on his forehead from Asano's slash across his head. Then they knew that this was Kira. They gave him the option of committing seppuku, but he was so frozen in fear he could not do it. So, Oishi just cut his head off. He took the tanto that he offered him, which was actually the same tanto that Asano used. And he cut his head off with it. Afterwards, they took the head, they went to Asano's grave, and they put the head there. This is all because back in the day, the way that a samurai showed his service was taking the head of an enemy and presenting it to your daimyo. Well, their daimyo was dead, so they put his head right at the grave of Asano. After this, they could have run away, but they didn't. All of this was very much bound in honor. So as a result, they actually turned themselves in for what they did. Well, the reason why they turned themselves in was the fact that during this time, vendettas were illegal. So, as a result, they knew that they just broke the law. And generally speaking, those who took part in a vendetta or something like this they were executed as criminals. Well, the shogun had a dilemma. Is he going to punish these guys as criminals, or is he going to do something else? Very much so, the shogun did not want to execute these guys. What they did for honor. They didn't do it just out of bloodlust. They did it for honor. They did it because their lord his death was caused by another man, and he was actually going to pardon them. But the shogun's advisors pretty much told him, you can't pardon this. If you pardon this, what's this going to lead to? So, what the shogun did was, instead of executing them as criminals, he let them commit seppuku as samurai. Now, many of you may say, well, what's the difference? They're dead anyways. The difference is as a criminal, you had no honor. You died as a criminal. What you did was a crime. You didn't get to commit seppuku. They would just cut your head off. As opposed to being able to die with your honor still intact. And, it was very different. Seppuku, just a little summary, you cut your abdomen open, and oftentimes in movies they show that the second cuts the head off completely. That is not the case for seppuku. You were actually expected to leave a little bit of skin there, because you only cut the head off of a criminal completely. You do not do a full decapitation. So the 47 were honored to be able to die with their dignity still intact, as opposed to being punished as if they're criminals. One of them was actually pardoned. Now the rest of the 47 Ronin, except for one, committed seppuku at the same time. Foi Kuzuman, the Kabukimono, his was delayed. He still committed seppuku, but it was much later. And the interesting thing about him is the fact that he told a very different story towards the end about what they did. As opposed to giving Kira the option of killing himself, seppuku, he said that they more or less stabbed and hacked him to death, and then they sawed his head off with a tanto. And also, part of the shogun's sentence was he also allowed the 47 Ronin to be buried with their master. So this was also a great honor for them that, they're being allowed seppuku and they're going to be buried with their master. After the Ronin committed seppuku, that one samurai that had kicked Oishi in the face actually went up to their graves and more or less said, now he knows that it's not that they weren't going to take revenge, they were waiting for the proper time. And as penance for what he did, he actually committed seppuku there as well. And interestingly, he is actually buried with the 47 Ronin. He left a letter there stating what he did and that he wished to be buried amongst these brave men. So he was. So after all this had happened, the 47 Ronin more or less became celebrities in Japan instantly, because something like this hadn't happened for a long time. Many thought that the original way of the warrior, devotion to one's lord to death, was forgotten. So as a result, this was a big deal because it showed that the way of the samurai wasn't dead, that it was very much still alive. That these Ronin took revenge when they knew that there's a good chance that they were going to die taking revenge, and that if they didn't die taking revenge, they were going to be punished and lose their lives after that. But they took revenge anyways. They didn't just find other jobs. They followed their master to death, the samurai way. Now, the interesting thing about their equipment was that they obviously couldn't have just gone and bought weapons and armor because this was a time of peace. Once again, they were being watched. If they would have went and bought suits of armor, this is going to raise suspicion. So, as a result, they couldn't do that. Some of them did have armor, some of them had their own armor, some of them had armor that was more or less heirloom armor. It belonged to their father, their great-grandfather, their great-great-grandfather, etc. But many of them didn't own armor at all. Keep in mind, back in times of peace, it was not uncommon for a samurai to sell his armor, weapons, things like that, because once again, there's no wars to be fought in. So if you need the money, selling your armor wouldn't necessarily be the worst thing you could do if you're trying to get, a quick buck, more or less. So what they did instead was, for helmets, many of them actually wore firemen's helmets, because these would offer them protection, obviously, but much less drawing attention than buying armor. Some of them had to make their own armor out of more or less what they could find. Keep in mind, back in feudal Japan, dried bamboo was used quite often to make armor, so this was probably one material that they used. Interestingly, when pictures of the 47 Ronin are shown, they are often wearing chainmail under their clothes. That's chainmail. That's not, it looks a lot like fishnets or something under there, but that's not what that is. That's chainmail. That was quite common, to wear armor under your clothes, so that you're wearing armor, but you're not drawing the attention of wearing armor. Because obviously, if you go around wearing armor in times of peace, you're going to draw quite a bit of attention. Now, another interesting thing is that some of the lengths of their swords were actually documented. This is interesting because it does happen sometimes that we have documented lengths of the swords of historical figures, but generally not in this scale. Out of the 47 Ronin, 33 of their swords were documented. The rest were not, for unknown reasons, but 33 of the lengths were documented. Now, the interesting thing about this is when we look at the lengths of the swords of the 47 Ronin, you will find that the lengths are pretty much all over the place, which is interesting because at the time there were sword laws in effect. The blade couldn't be longer than 27.4 inches, and the ska, which is the handle, could not be longer than 9.5 inches. The shortest sword length that was found among their swords for their daito, which is the long sword, was 22 inches. So in his daisho, the shortest sword had a 22-inch blade. The longest that was documented had a 3-shaku blade. It was a nodachi, pretty much. Oishi himself had a 33.5-inch blade. So this is a comparison between the two swords. This here is the length of what Oishi used, and this here is almost the length of what was used back then. And you will notice that the blade length difference is pretty significant. This sword right here now is just under 3-shaku. This one here is actually half an inch under 3-shaku. But as you can see, even more reach advantage. A 3-shaku blade would have just over an 8-inch reach advantage over the 27.4-inch blade. This reach advantage is pretty significant considering the fact that when cutting with a sword, you generally cut with the last 8 to 10 inches of the blade. Depending on who you ask, that's generally the monouchi. They will say it's between 8 to 10 inches. When you consider also that that is not always what you would use for cutting. Obviously, ideally, you'd want to cut with the monouchi, but quite often the cutting was done with the last few inches of the blade. I mean, like the last 6 inches of the blade. So when you consider that, now, if you're cutting with the last 6 inches of your blade, or maybe even less than that, consider that now, while Oishi is within range to cut, the other guy will get maybe 1 inch of cutting edge on him. And remember, armor. The 47 Ronin had armor. Most of the 47 Ronin, though, used swords that were between 32 to 34 inches. The length of their shoto was documented as well. The shortest one was a 1 shaku blade. This right here is just a 1/4 inch over 1 shaku, and it is a tanto. So obviously then, this blade that he carried was a tanto. Nothing abnormal about that. Now the longest shoto was a 28-inch blade. So just a 1/2 inch longer than this one right here. Now you may be looking at this and thinking, Adam, that's a katana. It is. He carried a 28-inch blade as his shoto and a 34-inch blade as his katana. Now this may seem strange until you realize that the idea of a set length for a katana, a wakizashi, a tanto was very much, it came later. It came with the advent of the sword laws of feudal Japan. The word daisho just means big and small, or long and short. That's all it means. Dai, big, sho, short. So, a daisho was just a set of swords in which one sword was bigger than the other. So, in this case, 28-inch blade, 34-inch blade, it's a daisho because one is bigger than the other. Historically, this was often the case in that, it wasn't necessarily a katana and wakizashi or katana and tanto. It could be pretty much any set in which one sword was bigger than the other. Now, when we consider the daito that the one had with the 22-inch blade, this may sound odd, because 22 inches is generally speaking considered more of a wakizashi length. However, some in peace times carried shorter blades because they were lighter, easier to go around town with. Once again, no wars to be fought in. And if you're more worried about fighting indoors, a shorter sword will be more maneuverable. The other interesting thing is that when you look at the list, it's also documented on who made the sword. Some of them, of course, wrote more or less unknown. They didn't have a signature, but many of them had signatures, and it was written down who made that sword. Also, their other weapons were documented as well. So if they had a bow, or a short spear, a long spear, or a naginata, this was all written down. It was all documented. Because once again, remember, this was a big deal at the time. And this was a time of peace. Japan hadn't had something like this happen for a very long time. So this was a big deal. The other interesting thing is that the longest sword out of all the ones that was documented was actually used by the oldest samurai. And he didn't have a shoto either. He didn't have a wakizashi, a tanto, nothing like that. He had a naginata for his polearm, and he had what was essentially a nodachi. The final fact that I'll be mentioning about their equipment is that during World War II, some of their swords actually got remounted. They got remounted to be used, as gunto. Just as happened with a lot of antiques, family heirlooms, etc. They got remounted, turned into gunto. Well, sadly, these swords became lost. Many swords during World War II got melted, buried, taken home as war souvenirs, thrown in the ocean, etc. So we don't know what happened to these swords that were refitted for World War II, these swords of the 47 Ronin. We don't know what happened to them. Luckily, they didn't all get remounted, but some of them did. And as I said, no one knows what happened to them. So they could be sitting in someone's attic, in someone's basement, in someone's prized collection, or they could have been, long destroyed. We don't really know. So that's pretty much it. I hope you guys enjoyed this. I do plan on doing more of this in the future. And that's pretty much it. So, thanks for watching. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. I'll see you next video. See ya.